So what it comes down to is dreams. Comic books are dreams. They tell stories, people dream of being the characters, people love where it takes them. This is the first introduction of Doctor Strange. There you go. It's all about the art. That's what moves us. That's why people collect comic books. I feel the same way about comic books and everything I collect as I do the original artwork which I collect. I'm not the owner, I'm the steward. I'm supposed to take care of them, and hopefully I can get them to people that will cherish and take care of them too. First Nick Fury, pretty cool. Comic books affect everybody's life. It certainly affected mine. Hi, so who the hell am I? My name is Tom Tataranowicz. I'm known as Tom T in the animation industry where I spent my career. Well, I'm here to talk about my comic collection of 10,000 comics that I'm now putting on the market. Being, I guess, an artist in my soul, I was always interested in comic books as long as I can remember. I grew up in Detroit collecting comic books from the 50s to the 60s to the mid-70s. And there's all kinds of stories about where these comics came from and everything. Nonetheless, in the 1970s, what happened? Well, I was fresh out of art school and I decided I wanted to work in animation. So my friend and I packed up our little yellow Volkswagen and drove 4,000 miles in 1 month to go to Los Angeles so I could work in the animation industry. When I left in 1975, the comics all stayed. The only comics I brought were my Conan the Barbarians. Don't ask me why. I also brought it with a case of a beer from Detroit called Stroh's Beer. And so it shows you where my priorities were lying as a 20-something-year-old. But anyway, when I got out here, my first job was with Ralph Bakshi on Lord of the Rings. After that, I worked with Frank Frazetta on Fire and Ice. I did a lot of the animation of the Tigra girl. And then I went to Filmation. I worked on Masters of the Universe and then ended up becoming producer at that studio and director of the Brave Star feature. And then I kicked around for a gig or two and ended up at Marvel Animation. And there I did Biker Mice from Mars, Fantastic Four, Iron Man, and the Hulk. Interestingly, years later, I met Jon Favreau, who was the director of the first Iron Man movie. And I talked to him. I said, oh, hi, I'm so-and-so, and I used to run Marvel Animation, and I did the Iron Man series. He goes, oh, you're the guy. And I said, yeah, I really like what you did with the movie. He goes, I got to tell you, I based my concept of that movie on that animated series, specifically the opening title. And I go, no, come on, really? He goes, yeah, remember the lyrics of the song? It was, I am Iron Man. Well, that's how I ended the first movie, remember? Tony Stark stands up and goes,
I am Iron Man.
And the whole concept of armor flying onto Tony Stark's arms and things forming, which I did as a way to incorporate as much armor as I could into the show to satisfy the toy companies without making it a moving commercial. And that's the legacy of comic books and animation. You don't know how far the influence will go. It's all about the legacy you leave behind, how it affects people, and what it means to them. That brings me back to the comics. When I got the second seasons of Fantastic Four and Iron Man, I decided what I wanted to do as producer was tell the stories based on what was in the comic books. Be faithful to the comic books I had grown up with and loved, which are part of my collection. So I did the storylines based on comic books that I thought were great. On Iron Man, I went to things such as Armor Wars. On the Incredible Hulk, it was the same thing. I went through and based it on characters and storylines that I had liked in the comics. Stories I thought were really cool, but still comic-based, because I feel fans really liked that. As a fan, I never really cared for, okay, here's a brand new story and it doesn't really feel like what I wanted. And so all my upbringing, all my reading, and all my collecting led to that. When my time at Marvel Animation was done, I subsequently formed my own studio. For lack of imagination, I guess, I called it Tom T Animation. Not the greatest name, but it worked, okay? And then we turned it into Gang of Seven Animation eventually, which was maybe a little better, but who knows. Anyway, one of the series we did was a reboot of Biker Mice from Mars. In the original series, I had developed it. I was executive producer, I was director, writer, all kinds of things, and was doing much the same thing with my studio. On Biker Mice from Mars, I had the privilege of hiring Bernie Wrightson. Bernie was one of the pivotal artists in comics, probably most famous for having co-created Swamp Thing in right here. It's House of Secrets number 92. Which is a classic. He did the Frankenstein plates, which, oh my God, there's never been any better illustration in the history of the world than these Frankenstein plates. And so he was actually working in the studio with us. on Biker Mice from Mars, designing characters, and also helping us develop animated horror films. And so getting a chance to work with him was an incredible privilege. For my money, he may be one of the very best artists in the history of comics. Incidentally, John Buscema, Michael Kaluta, and even Neil Adams are among comics legends I admired who worked on my various animated projects. So as you can see, comics are kind of a through line through my life and through my career, but we're not here to listen to my life story. We're here to talk about comic books. The first comics I really remember having were the Dell Tarzan comics, because I like Tarzan movies, and it just seemed kind of like a natural. How I got them is not just going down to the pharmacy and buying them, because that's where we bought comics back then, was like the pharmacy. There weren't any bookstores, there weren't any comic stores. We took buses down and we'd go to these little used bookstores, which were, God, tiny, 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 and we would look for comic books. And we would buy them, and they'd get them for 10 cents each, 25 cents each. So we'd rifle through their comic books and find what I wanted. To bolster that along, other than getting the comics that I bought myself, in Dearborn, Michigan, they had alleys. And in the alleys, they threw the trash. Well, young kids, what are young kids but trash pickers, right? One day, we found an entire oil drum full of comics that somebody was throwing out. Yeah, they threw out comics back then. People didn't keep them. We grabbed those. I remember feeling like Uncle Scrooge in his money bin, surrounded by comic upon comic upon comic, Tarzan, Turok, you name it. And then from that, I discovered DC Comics. So I read Superman and really loved Superboy. That's what I read for years and years. And then somebody introduced me to Marvel. Marvel was a revelation back then, with characters that had problems. And so then I started buying Spider-Man, Daredevil, and then Iron Man and Fantastic Four. And then there was Thor. And I still remember to this day the palpable feeling of reading that comic book, which, by the way, is right here. The fact that Jane Foster loved Don Blake and not Thor. Whoever saw that, where the heroine loved the secret identity and not the superhero. That was like incredible back then. Lois Lane loved Superman. Everybody was after the superhero. And I became fascinated with that and the Norse mythology, which eventually in my career led to me writing a script about the end of the Norse gods. And when I was at Marvel, I put Thor in a couple episodes in the Fantastic Four, because my lifelong passion was Thor. From there, I started buying the Marvel comic books, and DC kind of faded away a bit out of my collection. Spider-Man number 50 was a revelation to me. It really was, because that cover, everybody knows it, it's iconic. Spider-Man quit being Spider-Man, Peter Parker walked away. It's like, oh man, who does that? Everything Marvel was doing was just better and better and better, and encouraging me to grow as a young artist. I always felt the top of the line back then were the Marvel covers in the 60s. Jack Kirby's Thor covers were incredible. They just kept getting better, becoming more and more iconic. A comic I remember that really changed my life was Thor 145. Now the reason this was important is, once again, who read stories like this where the Thunder God was no longer the Thunder God? He got stripped of his powers. That simply didn't happen in comic books up till Marvel time. DC wasn't doing anything like that. Superman might lose powers with red kryptonite or something, but it didn't happen. And so this one, I remember buying at Northland Mall in Detroit and going home and reading it and reading it and reading it because it was so cool. And once again, it just sort of bolstered my affection for the Thor character. When I left Detroit in 1975, I left 10,000 comics back there. They were left at my parents' place for over 50 years. And for some reason, I can't even explain, my parents kept them safe, instead of giving them to my cousin or giving them to the church swap meet or something like that. And so last year, I had them all shipped out here, 700 pounds of comic books. Well, when they came out here, I didn't know what to do with it really. Kind of sat around for a while. I was starting to separate them. And with the help of friends and family, we spent 3 months organizing these things, so it made some sense, starting to bag and put boards in them. But I wasn't in a rush. Then came the Palisades fire of January 2025. I almost lost my home. Seriously, the fire came within 20 feet of my house. Somehow it survived, but if it hadn't, not only would I have lost my home, all this would be gone. I had to go, what am I doing with these things? They almost got burned and destroyed. I've got to get these to people that would really enjoy them and appreciate them instead of just being in boxes. I have many comic books here, such as Hulk 181 with Wolverine, the first Thor, runs of comics, almost a complete run of Spider-Man up into the 300s-400s. And so now I've decided I want to get them out there into the marketplace because they deserve good homes. They're not meant to be hoarded in my boxes somewhere in the garage. I've had them forever, but they need to go to people that want them and treasure them, rather than me having them in a box somewhere and going, yeah, I own them. While collecting, I've ended up with all kinds of material. For instance, back there is Detective Number 4. I wasn't born in 1937, but I ended up with that. Included in this collection, it's the things that I am the single owner of from the 50s, the 60s, into the 70s. When I was running Marvel Animation, they used to send me comic books, all kinds of comic books. And so I have those, and I really want to move those on. I even have a comic signed by the entire cast I voice directed on the Hulk animated series that includes Lou Ferrigno and Mark Hamill. Many keys are in this collection. I hope people will enjoy them and find things that they want or fill holes in their collections. I'm 72 years old as I sit here, and it's time for me to move it on to other people. Here are some of the gems in my collection. Here is, of course, Hulk 181, which was the first appearance of Wolverine, and it's about in as good a condition as you could ever hope for. Now, I remember buying this comic when I was in college and reading it and going, yeah, it's Wolverine's kind of interesting, but really, this yellow suit, I don't know. But anyway, I liked it, and here it is. Here we have Hulk number 4, where he's kicking some ass, and it was a really cool comic as a kid, because I'm reading this thing going, oh my God, here's a character that's supposed to be a hero, but he's not really. He's just kind of this dumb brute beating things up and breaking things, but somehow that really appealed, and I guess that appeal continues to this day. Here we have, well, you know what this is. This is the giant size X-Men number 1, and I remember getting this in college, and it was very cool because now the team had come back together after the X-Men series being canceled. For those of you that don't know, think about it. X-Men was actually canceled because nobody was buying it. And so they did some reprints, and then they came out with this and introduced this whole new team of characters. And it was incredibly exciting because it was something different. You could sense they were on their way to do something. And I stuck with the entire run of X-Men and all the way through the John Byrne, Terry Austin years. And I actually went to college with Terry Austin. He and I used to talk comics all the time. Here's X-Men number 94. I believe this is what brought back the X-Men franchise. And it's got a Gil Kane cover, and it was just very cool. It's like, wow, now this thing's taken off again. And it was different than the old X-Men had been in the pre-Neil Adams days. So that kind of kicked me off on loving X-Men. And here's Biker Mice from Mars. Now, Biker Mice from Mars is something I'm particularly happy with, not because it's the world's most collectible comic, but I developed and I produced and directed nearly 100 episodes of this series. So I have a real soft spot in my heart for it. But really what you want to see probably is this, which is Avengers number 57, which features the first appearance of the Vision. The thing about this to focus on, in my opinion, Marvel Comics in the 60s, the covers were so dynamic. Buscema did iconic covers. Romita did iconic covers. Kirby did iconic covers. They jumped off the page at you, and the coloring was dark and detailed and rich. It wasn't gaudy. It wasn't overcrowded. And now let's move on to some lesser known characters. Okay, here we have, who the hell is this? Anybody recognize this? Anyway, this is Spider-Man number 6, and it features the Lizard. And then there was Doctor Doom. They started doing all these crossovers at Marvel. Then here's the first appearance of Kraven. And here's the first appearance of the Scorpion, which also was just very cool because these stories focused on J. Jonah Jameson and Peter Parker, which was pretty weird to have that kind of whole thing going on in a superhero comic. This one was one of the all-time cool covers back then. You simply never saw anything like this before. This weird pop art cover, this negative thing. It was a mind blower. You have to think back then and go, nobody's ever seen anything like this, and it was beautiful. Here's a comic that the number 31, I believe, yes, 31, Spider-Man, which began, for my money, the most intriguing and coolest storyline in the whole Spider-Man saga, which was Peter Parker going to college, and he first meets Gwen Stacy in that crowd, and then he ends up trapped under this incredibly heavy machine as Aunt May is dying, and he goes on a rampage. And the palpable sense of how this was done by Steve Ditko, of him thinking about his aunt, thinking about his life, thinking about Uncle Ben. You could feel the strain, because he lifted this machine that must have been the weight of the battleship Potemkin off of him and broke free. It was so cool. It's one of the few comics that actually gave me chills. And then after that, Ditko left and Romita took over, John Romita. And here's when Spider-Man was unmasked by the Green Goblin. And you had never seen anything like this before in comics. Well, there's only one thing that's going to happen. Somebody has to die. You hope it wasn't Spider-Man. So the Green Goblin had to die, and they found their way through that. In this issue, another iconic cover. And the thing about these covers back then is, once again, the richness of the coloring, the subtlety of the coloring, and the way they were printed. This is the first appearance of the Rhino, which had some of the all-time great Stan Lee jokes in it, as far as I'm concerned. Here Spidey fights J. Jonah Jameson's son. And more importantly, it's the introduction of Mary Jane. And nobody could draw pretty girls back then like John Romita. And for a teenager, well, as Stan Lee would say, enough said. And then this one was absolutely a revelation, because now Peter Parker quit being Spider-Man in this, one of the great covers of all time, in my opinion. Once again, you never saw anything like this in a comic back then. It was unheard of. And they made it work because he was feeling guilty over Aunt May and Uncle Ben and the responsibility of power. It was so cool, it was beyond belief. And now we have X-Men, starting out in my collection with number 6, which had the X-Men meeting the Submariner, and when Marvel was doing all kinds of crossovers trying to sell their other comics. So they would do that regularly. And that was very cool, because I didn't know anything about the Submariner largely at that time. And then this one is the Blob, which became a perennial sort of X-Men villain. And there are a number of them here. I have a pretty complete run of a lot of these. Here's this one where he fights Lucifer, okay? And the Stranger shows up, who actually shows up later on, I believe, in a Silver Surfer comic, years later. And then here's the introduction of Kazar, who's basically Tarzan in the X-Men series. And just so you don't think DC gets short shrift, here's Teen Titans #1. And this was very cool because it was about teenagers with superheroes, and they had their own comic. Now, Marvel had the X-Men, but they were kind of weird in a way. They were kind of odd characters. These were just superheroes. They did superhero things, and it was very cool and appealing to a young teenager. And then we're back to my all-time favorite, probably, Marvel character, which is the Mighty Thor. To me, one of the great things about Marvel in the 60s was how they kept getting better and better and better, literally every single month. The covers started getting better and better. On Thor, Jack Kirby was hitting a stride, and it didn't stop. They just became more iconic. Part of that was the drawing and the layouts. Part of it was the coloring. Marvel had such rich coloring, and the way it was printed was great. There was the right amount of darkness. It popped from the page. It wasn't garish, and it wasn't overcrowded. I mean, look at this cover. Look at this one. I mean, that's just, you can't help but want to buy this thing. When as a kid, you see that and go, what is this? He's forging something cool. And then every once in a while, there's one of these, which is kind of like the greatest hits of the comic of the day. They're showing all kinds of stuff, and you could study each one for hours and hours and just want to read the story many times. It was that cool. Here was the introduction of Crusher Creel. Once again, you can see how the comic covers are becoming more and more dynamic. And DC was doing at the time kind of doughy Superman covers. They were good, but they weren't as exciting. Jack Kirby was strictly setting the bar for something here. Look at this. Look at Odin here. So dynamic, so powerful. Here's Thor busting through a wall. Once it's strength, power. Then here comes Hercules, for God's sake. Okay, cool. I love the Steve Reeves movies, and all of a sudden here was Hercules. And look at how powerful that is. And then you want Thor? Here's probably the iconic Thor pose. He's coming right at you, which means buy this thing and collect it, kid, and you're going to love it. And then this one, right in your face. You could almost feel like you get punched in the face if they let go with each other. It was so strong and so dynamic, and you could read it at a glance. Here's a dead Thor in Odin's hands. Come on. it was just so cool. The stories were so cool. They were everything, like every single month, it just got better and better and better all the way through. And as I said, I have an almost complete run of the Thors up into the 300s. And that's something else that I'm hoping to pass on to some good homes. Comics and entertainment is simply about enjoyment. Virtually all these comics I have been in my possession exclusively for the last 70 years, practically. The best thing for me to be would be to hear, I got one of your comics from what is euphemistically called the Tom T Time Capsule, and say, that was such an important issue for me to find. I've been looking for it for years and I got it. That would mean a lot to me because I feel I've passed it on to a good home.
We want to see if we have the 300. That's the key.
We should do a drum roll.
I know. Yeah, I know you have it. These are really pristine looking books. First Puma, second Puma here. Here, the very first cameo appearance of Venom. Looks like a great book. The Great Craven book here. 2 newsstand editions of issue number 300, the first appearance of Venom. I don't know, what do you think? Maybe $2,500 for this book? Okay, stop her.
Deb on the run, Deb on the run, Deb